The distant wail of the stagecoach horn carried across the dusty main street of Silver Creek, Arizona. But Josephine Dawson heard nothing over the pounding of her own heart as she fled through the darkness, one hand clutching her small carpet bag, the other protectively cradling the swell of her 5-month pregnancy. The year was 1878, and she had exactly $2.17 to her name, all that remained after her late husband's gambling debts were settled. The moon hung high in the October sky, casting long shadows as Josephine's boots kicked up dust along the trail leading out of town. Her breath came in ragged gasps, partly from exertion and partly from fear that someone might have followed her. Behind her lay the remnants of a life she could no longer bear. Ahead lay nothing but uncertainty and the child growing inside her. 3 miles outside Silver Creek, Josephine's pace finally slowed. Her legs trembled with exhaustion, and she allowed herself to sink down beside a gnarled mesquite tree. The night air carried a chill that penetrated her thin shawl, causing her to shiver violently. As she pressed her palm against her rounded belly, she whispered, "We'll be all right, little one. Somehow, we'll be all right." The sound of approaching hoofbeats sent a jolt of terror through her body. Josephine scrambled to her feet, searching desperately for somewhere to hide, but the sparse desert landscape offered little cover. She pressed herself against the trunk of the mesquite tree and held her breath. The rider slowed his horse to a walk, peering through the darkness. "Hello." A deep voice called out, "Miss, I can see you there by the tree." Josephine remained silent, clutching her carpetbag like a shield. "I'm not here to cause trouble," the voice continued. "Name's Garrett Zachary. I work the Diamond Cross Ranch north of here." The rider dismounted, keeping a respectful distance. "Saw you leaving town in an awful hurry. Thought you might need help." The moonlight illuminated his tall figure as he stepped closer, a broad-shouldered man with a worn Stetson and a kind face weathered by sun and wind. He couldn't have been more than 30 years old. "I don't need any help," Josephine replied, her voice stronger than she felt. "I'm just traveling on." Garrett nodded slowly. "Traveling mighty light for the desert, and in your condition." His eyes briefly touched on her pregnant belly before returning respectfully to her face. "My condition is none of your concern," she said sharply. "No, madam, it's not." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small leather purse. "But the desert at night is no place for anyone alone, especially not." He gestured vaguely toward her middle. Before Josephine could protest, he extended the purse toward her. "Take this and breathe. Just breathe for a moment and think about what you're doing." Josephine stared at the offered purse. "I don't accept charity from strangers." "It's not charity," Garrett said quietly. "It's neighborly concern. There's $40 in there, enough to get you to the next town in the morning stage and put you up for a few nights while you figure things out." Josephine's hand trembled as she reluctantly accepted the purse, its weight substantial in her palm. "Why would you do this for someone you don't know?" Garrett's eyes, the color of faded denim, met hers steadily. "Because my ma taught me that a person's worth isn't measured by what they have, but by what they give when they see someone in need." He tipped his hat slightly. "Now, where are you headed?" "I don't know," Josephine admitted, the fight draining from her voice. "Anywhere but Silver Creek." Garrett nodded thoughtfully. "Stage comes through at dawn heading to Tucson. From there you could go most anywhere." He glanced at the night sky. "It's nearly midnight. There's a line shack about half a mile up this trail, not much, but it's got a roof and a place to rest until morning." Josephine hesitated, her instincts warring between distrust and desperation. "I won't be staying there," Garrett added, reading her expression. "Got to get back to the ranch before sunrise, but you'd be safe until the stage comes." After a moment's consideration, Josephine nodded. "Thank you, Mr. Zachary." "Just Garrett, madam." He offered his hand to help her up, and after a brief hesitation, she took it. They walked in silence, Garrett leading his horse by the reins while Josephine trudged beside him, her weariness evident in every step. The lined shack appeared as a dark silhouette against the starlit sky, little more than a one-room structure with a sagging porch. Garrett lit a lantern hanging by the door, illuminating a sparse interior with a small iron stove, a narrow cot, and a rickety table with one chair. "It's not much," he said apologetically, setting the lantern on the table. "It's more than I had an hour ago," Josephine replied softly. Garrett nodded, then removed his saddle bags from his horse. "Got some jerky, hardtack, and a bit of coffee here. Not exactly a feast, but it'll keep body and soul together till morning." He placed the provisions on the table. "Stage stop is just down the main trail. Can't miss, it has a big windmill beside it." Josephine set her carpet bag on the floor and slowly lowered herself into the chair. "Mr. Zachary Garrett, I don't know how to thank you." A small smile creased his weathered face. "No need for thanks. Just take care of yourself," and he nodded toward her belly, the little one. As he turned to leave, Josephine suddenly asked, "How did you know I was leaving town?" "Were you following me?" Garrett paused at the door. "No, madam. I was at the Silver Spur Saloon when that ruckus broke out. Heard folks talking about Henry Dawson's widow and her delicate condition, being left with nothing but debts." His expression turned apologetic. "Small towns don't keep many secrets." Josephine's face flushed with embarrassment and anger. "So everyone knows." "Folks talk," Garrett said simply. "I was heading back to Diamond Cross when I saw someone hurrying out of town. Didn't know for certain it was you until I got closer." He adjusted his hat. "Rest now. Morning comes early in these parts." After he left, Josephine sat motionless for several minutes, listening to the receding sound of hoofbeats. Finally, she opened the leather purse and counted out $45 more money than she'd seen in months. Beneath the money was a small slip of paper with neat handwriting. "Diamond Cross Ranch, North Creek Valley." Exhaustion overtook her as she stretched out on the narrow cot, one hand resting protectively on her belly. Her last thoughts before sleep claimed her were of the tall cowboy with kind eyes who had appeared from nowhere like some guardian angel in the Arizona desert. Dawn broke with the harsh clarity typical of the high desert, pink and gold lights streaming through the single dusty window of the lined shack. Josephine woke disoriented, momentarily forgetting where she was until the events of the previous night came flooding back. She sat up slowly, her back aching from the thin mattress, and rested her hand instinctively on her swollen abdomen. "Good morning, little one," she whispered. "Today we start fresh." After washing her face with water from a barrel outside, Josephine arranged her dark hair into a simple bun and changed into her only other dress, a faded blue calico that strained slightly across her growing middle. She ate a modest breakfast of hardtack and jerky, washing it down with water, saving the coffee for another time. With her few belongings packed, Josephine set out for the stage stop, arriving just as the morning sun crested the eastern mountains. A weathered wooden building with a sagging porch stood beside a tall windmill whose blades creaked in the morning breeze. Two other passengers, an elderly couple, already waited on the porch. The stagecoach arrived in a cloud of dust, 6 horses pulling the swaying vehicle to a stop before the station. The driver, a leathery-faced man with a gray mustache, tipped his hat to Josephine. "Morning, madam. Heading to Tucson." Josephine nodded, producing the fare from her newly acquired purse. "Yes, sir." As the driver loaded her small carpet bag, Josephine glanced back down the trail towards Silver Creek, her heart oddly heavy. She had lived there for 3 years since marrying Henry, Yet nothing remained for her now but painful memories and unpaid debts. Henry had been a dreamer, always chasing the next big strike, convinced that wealth lay just around the corner. His death in a mining accident 2 months ago had revealed the truth of their situation. They owned nothing and owed much. The whispered words that followed her in town had become unbearable. Poor widow Dawson. Such a shame about the child. Wonder who'll take her in now. The final indignity had come yesterday when Mr. Fleming, the bank manager, had suggested that arrangements could be made regarding her debts if she were to consider certain propositions from him. She had fled that night, taking only what she could carry. The stagecoach journey to Tucson took 8 bone-jarring hours, during which Josephine stared out the window at the passing landscape, contemplating her future. The elderly couple, the Hendersons, were kind enough, sharing their packed lunch and asking few questions beyond her name and condition. "Traveling alone in your state is mighty brave, Mrs. Dawson," Mrs. Henderson observed gently. "Sometimes bravery is just doing what must be done," Josephine replied. By late afternoon, the stagecoach rolled into Tucson, a bustling town considerably larger than Silver Creek. Josephine bid the Hendersons goodbye and found herself standing on the boardwalk of a busy street, her carpetbag at her feet, uncertain of her next move. The driver had recommended a boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Carleton that sometimes took in women in difficult circumstances. With directions in hand, Josephine made her way through the unfamiliar streets until she found the 2-story clapboard house with a sign reading, "Carleton Boarding House, Clean Rooms, Reasonable Rates." Mrs. Carleton proved to be a stern-faced woman in her 50s with sharp eyes that missed nothing. She looked Josephine up and down, her gaze lingering on her rounded middle. "How far along are you?" she asked bluntly. "5 months, madam. Husband, deceased. Mining accident." Mrs. Carleton's expression softened slightly. "I have a room on the 2nd floor, back corner. $5 a week, includes breakfast and supper. No gentlemen callers, no drinking, no coming in after 9 o'clock. "That seems fair," Josephine said, relieved. "I'll take it for 2 weeks to start." After settling into the small but clean room, Josephine counted her remaining money, $38 and some cents. Enough to give her time to find work, but not much beyond that. Tomorrow, she would begin looking for employment, though she knew her options would be limited in her condition. That night, lying in an unfamiliar bed, Josephine found herself thinking of Garrett Zachary, the cowboy whose unexpected kindness had given her this chance at a fresh start. She wondered if she would ever see him again, and was surprised by how much she hoped she might. 3 days in Tucson had yielded no employment prospects for Josephine. Shop owners and businesses took one look at her swelling belly and shook their heads. By the 4th day, desperation was beginning to set in when she noticed a sign in the window of Hargrove's General Store. "Assistant needed, inquire within." Mr. Hargrove, a portly man with mutton chop whiskers, frowned when Josephine inquired about the position. "You're in a family way," he stated flatly. "Yes, sir, but I'm strong and capable. I can keep books, arrange merchandise, and handle customers with courtesy." "How long before?" He gestured vaguely toward her middle. "About 4 months, sir." Hargrove scratched his chin thoughtfully. "My wife's been after me to hire some help. She's not been well lately." He studied Josephine for a moment. "Can you start today? 6 days a week, 9 till 6, $2 a week plus a 5% commission on fancy goods you sell." The pay was meager, but it was work. "Yes, sir." "Thank you, Mr. Hargrove." That evening, returning to her boarding house, Josephine felt a small measure of hope for the first time since leaving Silver Creek. She had work, a roof over her head, and enough money to last until the baby came if she was careful. Yet as she prepared for bed, an inexplicable loneliness swept over her. She found herself thinking again of Garrett Zachary and wondering what might have happened had she stayed near Silver Creek. "Don't be foolish," she whispered to herself. "He was just being kind to a woman in trouble." Nothing more. 2 weeks passed, and Josephine settled into a routine at Hargrove's store. Her natural aptitude for organization and her gentle manner with customers had quickly made her valuable to the Hargroves. Mrs. Hargrove, a frail woman with a persistent cough, had taken a particular liking to Josephine, often inviting her to take tea in the back room during quiet afternoons. "You have a good head for business," Mrs. Hargrove remarked one day. "Most women don't bother with such things, but a widow must think practically." "My father was a teacher," Josephine explained. "He believed girls should be educated the same as boys. And your husband, was he a businessman?" Josephine hesitated. "Henry was, a dreamer, always looking for the next opportunity." She chose her words carefully. "He wasn't much for the day-to-day practicalities." Mrs. Hargrove nodded knowingly. "Men often aren't. That's why a wise woman keeps her own counsel when it comes to household matters." The bell above the shop door jangled, and Josephine excused herself to attend to the customer. She stopped short at the sight of a familiar tall figure examining a display of work gloves. "Mr. Zachary." Garrett Zachary turned, surprise giving way to a warm smile that reached his eyes. "Mrs. Dawson. Well, I'll be." He removed his hat. "Didn't expect to find you in Tucson." Josephine felt her face flush with unexpected pleasure. "I work here now, have done for 2 weeks." Garrett nodded approvingly. "Glad to hear it. You're looking well," and she was. Despite her advancing pregnancy, there was color in her cheeks and a steadiness in her gaze that had been absent that night on the desert trail. "What brings you to Tucson?" she asked, suddenly conscious of her work apron and hastily arranged hair. "Ranch business. Delivering some papers to the land office and picking up supplies." He gestured to the gloves. "Need a new pair. These old ones have seen better days." He held up hands covered by well-worn leather gloves with several holes. Josephine slipped easily into her role as shop assistant. "We have several styles. The deerskin ones are the most comfortable, but the cowhide last longer." As she helped him select a pair, they fell into easy conversation. Garrett asked about her situation, and Josephine found herself sharing details of her life at the boarding house and her work at the store. "The pay isn't much," she admitted, "but it's honest work and the Hargroves are kind employers." "And after the baby comes?" Garrett asked gently. Josephine's hands stilled on the gloves she was wrapping in paper. "I haven't thought that far ahead," she confessed. "One day at a time seems all I can manage." Garrett nodded understandingly. "Sometimes that's all any of us can do." He paid for the gloves and hesitated before adding, "I'm staying at the Western Hotel tonight, heading back to Diamond Cross tomorrow. Would you? That is, might you consider having supper with me this evening? Just as friends, of course." Josephine was surprised by the invitation and by how much she wanted to accept. "My boarding house has strict rules. No gentlemen callers, and I must be in by 9 o'clock. We could meet at the hotel dining room at 6, Garrett suggested. "I'd have you back well before your curfew." After a moment's hesitation, Josephine nodded. "I would like that, Mr. Zachary." "Garrett, please." "Garrett," she echoed, feeling a strange flutter that had nothing to do with the baby. That evening, Josephine wore her best dress, a navy blue with small white dots that she had let out slightly to accommodate her growing figure. "Mrs. Carlton raised an eyebrow when Josephine mentioned she was dining with an acquaintance from Silver Creek, but merely reminded her of the 9 o'clock rule. The Western Hotel dining room was the finest establishment, Josephine had entered since arriving in Tucson. Crystal glasses and white tablecloths adorned the tables, and a small orchestra played quietly in the corner. Garrett was waiting just inside the entrance, looking somewhat uncomfortable in a clean shirt and string tie, his hair still damp from washing. "Mrs. Dawson," he said, standing as she approached. "You look lovely." Josephine felt herself blushing. "Thank you, and please call me Josephine." Dinner was the most pleasant evening Josephine had experienced in months. Garrett proved to be an attentive listener, and surprisingly knowledgeable about a range of topics. He spoke of his ranch, 300 acres of decent grazing land with a creek running through it, and of his dreams to expand it someday. "It's not much compared to some spreads," he admitted, "but it's mine, free and clear. Took 5 years of saving every penny while working as a hand on other ranches, but I haven't owed a man a dime in 3 years now." "That's impressive," Josephine said sincerely. "My husband—" She paused, then decided on honesty. "Henry was always in debt, always chasing the next big chance rather than building something solid." Garrett's expression was sympathetic but not pitying. "Some men are built that way. My own father was similar, always looking for the shortcut to prosperity. Died broke in a Denver boarding house. I'm sorry." "It was a long time ago," Garrett said. "Taught me the value of patience and hard work, though." As they lingered over coffee, Garrett asked hesitantly, "Have you considered what you'll do when your time comes? For the birthing, I mean." Josephine's hand instinctively went to her belly. "Mrs. Carlton says there's a midwife who attends to the women at the boarding house. It's part of why she took me in." Garrett nodded. "That's good." He paused, then added, "I was thinking, that is, I wanted to ask if you might consider." He took a deep breath. Diamond Cross could use a housekeeper. The cabin's not much, but it's solid with 2 bedrooms and a good roof. The air is clean and there'd be fresh milk and eggs daily. Josephine stared at him, stunned. "Are you offering me employment?" "Yes," Garrett said quickly. "As a housekeeper. There'd be a proper wage, of course, and time to rest before and after your confinement." "You don't know me," Josephine said softly. "Why would you offer such a thing to a stranger?" Garrett's eyes, earnest and clear, met hers. "I know enough. I know you're courageous and determined. I know you're facing the hardest time in a woman's life without family or friends to support you." He hesitated. "And I know what it's like to be alone in the world." The sincerity in his voice touched something deep within Josephine. "It's a generous offer, but I couldn't possibly just consider it," Garrett interrupted gently. "I'm heading back tomorrow, but I'll be in Tucson again in 3 weeks' time. If you're interested, I could bring a wagon then. If not, no hard feelings." Later that night, lying in her narrow bed at the boarding house, Josephine weighed Garrett's offer against her current situation. The work at Hargrove's was secure for now, but what would happen when the baby came? Would they hold her position? And how would she manage an infant while working full days at the store? Diamond Cross Ranch was an unknown quantity, as was Garrett Zachary himself. Yet something about the quiet cowboy inspired trust. He had already shown her kindness when he had nothing to gain from it. "What should we do, little one?" she whispered, rubbing her belly gently. As if in answer, the baby kicked a strong, decisive movement that made her smile. The following 3 weeks passed quickly. Josephine continued her work at Hargrove's, but now she found herself watching the street through the shop window, half expecting to see Garrett's tall figure. She had not given him an answer about his offer, and as the days passed, she found herself increasingly torn. Mrs. Hargrove noticed her distraction. "You seem preoccupied, dear. Is everything all right?" Josephine hesitated, then confided in the older woman about Garrett's offer. Mrs. Hargrove listened thoughtfully. "This Mr. Zachary, what manner of man is he? You said you barely know him." "That's true," Josephine admitted. "But he helped me when I had nothing, expected nothing in return, and has been nothing but respectful." She sighed. "Still, moving to an isolated ranch with a man I hardly know seems imprudent." "Life seldom offers perfect choices, especially for women in your situation," Mrs. Hargrove said pragmatically. "What does your instinct tell you about this man?" Josephine considered the question. "That he is honest, kind, hardworking." She smiled slightly. "The sort of man who would give money to a desperate stranger and expect nothing in return." Mrs. Hargrove patted her hand. "Then perhaps you have your answer." Exactly 3 weeks after their dinner, Garrett Zachary walked into Hargrove's general store. He looked travel-worn but clean, his hat in his hands as he approached the counter where Josephine was arranging a display of ribbons. "Mrs. Dawson," he greeted her, a hopeful note in his voice. "Mr. Zachary," she replied, suddenly nervous. "You're punctual." "A man's word should mean something," he said simply. Then, more hesitantly, "Have you given any thought to my offer?" Josephine took a deep breath. "I have, and if it still stands, I would like to accept on a trial basis. 3 months, after which either of us can end the arrangement if it's not suitable." Relief and pleasure transformed Garrett's weathered face. "That seems more than fair. When would you like to leave?" "I need to give the Hargroves notice and settle my account at the boarding house." "Could you return tomorrow?" Garrett nodded. "I'll be here at noon with the wagon." He hesitated, then added, "I'm glad, Josephine. Diamond Cross will be a good place for you and the little one." The next day was a flurry of activity as Josephine said her goodbyes to the Hargroves, who expressed genuine regret at her departure, and to Mrs. Carleton, who merely nodded and wished her well in her new position. By noon, her few possessions were packed, and she stood on the boardwalk outside Hargroves, awaiting Garrett's arrival. The wagon appeared precisely at noon, drawn by 2 sturdy workhorses. Garrett jumped down to help Josephine up to the seat, handling her carpetbag and the small trunk she had acquired during her stay in Tucson. "It's about 4 hours to Diamond Cross," he explained as they set out. "The road's decent most of the way, but it gets rough the last few miles." The journey passed pleasantly, the October air cool but not cold, the desert landscape stretching around them in rugged beauty. Garrett pointed out landmarks and shared stories about the area's history, Apache raids from years past, old mining claims, and the changing patterns of settlement as the railroad pushed westward. As they traveled further from Tucson, the terrain changed, becoming less desert and more high country, with scattered junipers and pines appearing among the cacti and scrub. Finally, they crested a ridge and Garrett pulled the wagon to a stop. "There it is," he said, a note of pride in his voice. Diamond Cross. Below them stretched a green valley with a silver ribbon of creek winding through it. A neat cabin with a covered porch stood near a cluster of outbuildings. A small herd of cattle grazed in a nearby pasture, and a corral held several horses. It wasn't grand, but it was well maintained, with split rail fences and a large vegetable garden visible behind the cabin. "It's lovely," Josephine said sincerely. Garrett smiled. "It's home." As they approached the cabin, a black and white border collie raced out to greet them, barking excitedly. "That's Patch," Garrett explained. "Best cattle dog in the territory." He helped Josephine down from the wagon, steadying her with a gentle hand. "Let me show you around before we unload your things." The cabin was simple but comfortable, with a large main room that served as kitchen and living area, complete with a stone fireplace. 2 bedrooms opened off the main room, and a lean-to at the back housed a washroom with a large copper tub. "This will be your room," Garrett said, showing her the smaller of the 2 bedrooms. It contained a narrow bed, a chest of drawers, and a small rocking chair by the window. "It's not much, but I thought the rocker might be useful when the baby comes." The thoughtfulness of this gesture brought unexpected tears to Josephine's eyes. "It's perfect, thank you." Garrett looked embarrassed by her emotion. "Well, I'll fetch your things while you get settled. There's stew on the stove for supper and fresh bread I got in town." That evening, as they sat across from each other at the sturdy pine table, eating beef stew and freshly baked bread, Josephine felt an unfamiliar sense of peace. The cabin was warm, the food was good, and for the first time in months, she didn't feel the crushing weight of uncertainty pressing down on her. "I want to be clear about your duties," Garrett said as they finished the meal. "I expect you to keep the cabin tidy, do the cooking, and handle the washing. There's a garden that needs tending and the chickens need looking after." He paused. "But in your condition, I don't expect heavy work, and after the baby comes, we'll adjust things accordingly." "That sounds fair," Josephine agreed. "And my wages? $20 a month plus room and board for you and the child, more if the ranch does well this year." It was a generous arrangement, far better than she could have hoped for in town. "Thank you, Garrett. I'll earn my keep, I promise." He smiled, the corners of his eyes crinkling. "I never doubted it." As November turned to December, Josephine settled into life at Diamond Cross. The work was not easy. There was always cooking, cleaning, mending, and gardening to be done. But it was satisfying in a way her job at the general store had never been. Here, she could see the direct results of her labor: a well-kept home, good meals, a productive garden despite the winter season. Garrett was gone much of each day, tending to cattle, mending fences, and handling the 1,000 tasks required to keep a small ranch running. Yet he was unfailingly considerate, bringing in firewood before Josephine could think to ask, building shelves for her kitchen supplies, and even constructing a cradle from pine boards in preparation for the baby's arrival. Their evenings fell into a comfortable pattern. After supper, they would sit by the fire, Garrett often whittling or repairing tack, while Josephine sewed baby clothes from fabric he had brought from town. Their conversations ranged widely, from books they had read to experiences from their earlier lives. Josephine learned that Garrett had been orphaned at 14, had worked as a cattle driver, a miner, and even briefly as a deputy in a Kansas town, before saving enough to buy his own land. He spoke little of relationships, though he did mention a girl back in Missouri who had married another while he was off seeking his fortune. In turn, Josephine shared stories of her childhood in Pennsylvania, where her father had taught in a small school, and of her journey west after his death 5 years earlier. She spoke less of her marriage to Henry, though Garrett seemed to understand the omission without pressing for details. As Christmas approached, Josephine's pregnancy became more pronounced, her movements more awkward as the baby grew. Garrett quietly took on more of the household tasks without mentioning it, bringing in a young local girl, Maria, to help with laundry and the heavier cleaning once a week. On Christmas Eve, Josephine woke to find Garrett gone from the cabin and a small pine tree standing in the corner of the main room. When he returned from his morning chores, he produced a sack of oranges, nuts, and stick candy from town. "Thought we might have a proper Christmas," he explained somewhat sheepishly. "There's popcorn we could string for the tree if you're feeling up to it." That evening, they decorated the small tree with strung popcorn, paper chains Josephine crafted from old newspapers, and a star Garrett had whittled from pine. After a supper of roast chicken and sweet potatoes, they exchanged modest gifts: a knitted scarf Josephine had worked on secretly during afternoons, and a delicate silver brooch Garrett had purchased in Tucson. "It was my mother's," he explained as Josephine admired the simple floral design. One of the few things of hers I kept. Garrett, I can't accept this, it's too valuable, too personal. I want you to have it, he insisted. She would have liked you practical and brave like she was. Josephine pinned the brooch to her collar, deeply touched by the gesture. As the fire crackled in the hearth and the scent of pine filled the cabin, she felt a contentment she had not known in years, perhaps ever. I have something else for you, Garrett said after a moment, reaching behind his chair to produce a small wooden box with a hinged lid. For the baby. Inside nestled a tiny silver rattle with a smooth wooden handle. It's beautiful, Josephine whispered, her fingers tracing the delicate engraving. Every child should have something special, Garrett said simply. Later, as Josephine prepared for bed, she caught sight of herself in the small mirror above her dresser, cheeks flushed, eyes bright, the silver brooch gleaming at her throat. For the first time in months she looked happy, and she realized with some surprise. Despite her awkward situation, despite the uncertainty of the future, she was genuinely happy here at Diamond Cross with this quiet, honorable man who had shown her nothing but respect and kindness. With that realization came another, more unsettling one. She was developing feelings for Garrett Zachary that went beyond gratitude or friendship. Don't be foolish, she whispered to her reflection. You're a pregnant widow he hired out of charity. He sees you as a responsibility, nothing more. Yet that night, as she drifted toward sleep, Josephine couldn't help wondering if perhaps, someday, there might be a chance for something more between them. January brought cold winds and occasional snow flurries to Diamond Cross. Josephine's pregnancy advanced into its final weeks, her movements becoming increasingly cumbersome. Garrett insisted she rest more, often taking over meal preparation in the evenings despite her protests. I'm not an invalid, she objected one afternoon after finding him kneading bread dough at the kitchen table. Never said you were, he replied calmly, but even the strongest horse needs rest before a long journey. The midwife, Mrs. Abernathy, began visiting weekly, a stern-faced woman with capable hands and a surprisingly gentle manner. She approved of the preparations. Josephine had made clean linens, swaddling clothes, the sturdy cradle Garrett had built. You're carrying high, she observed during one visit. Could be a boy. She glanced around the cabin approvingly. You've landed on your feet here, Mrs. Dawson. Mr. Zachary runs a good property. It's just an employment arrangement, Josephine felt compelled to clarify. Mrs. Abernathy raised an eyebrow but said nothing. In the evenings, as the winter winds howled outside, the cabin became a cozy haven. Sometimes Garrett would read aloud from one of the few books he owned, a volume of Shakespeare's plays, a history of the Western Territories, a dog-eared copy of The Last of the Mohicans. Josephine found herself watching his face in the firelight, the strong lines of his jaw, the crinkles at the corners of his eyes when he smiled, the careful way he turned the pages with his work-roughened hands. One night, as they sat in comfortable silence, Josephine felt a powerful contraction grip her abdomen. She gasped, clutching the arm of her chair. Garrett was instantly alert. Is it time? Josephine nodded, unable to speak until the pain passed. I think so, but the pains are still far apart. Garrett was on his feet immediately. I'll saddle Blaze and fetch Mrs. Abernathy. There's no need to rush, Josephine said, trying to keep her voice steady. First babies often take their time, she said, but Garrett was already pulling on his coat. Better to have her here and not need her than the other way around. While he was gone, Josephine moved slowly around the cabin, gathering the items Mrs. Abernathy had told her to prepare. The contractions were still infrequent, but each one took her breath away with its intensity. She had just changed into her nightgown and was lowering herself onto the bed when she heard the wagon approaching. Mrs. Abernathy swept in, assessing the situation with professional efficiency. "Still early stages," she pronounced after examining Josephine. "Could be hours yet." "Mr. Zachary, you make yourself useful by keeping water hot and staying out of the way." Garrett nodded, his face tense with concern. "Is there anything else needed?" "Not at present. This is women's work now." She softened slightly. "She'll be fine. She's strong and the baby's positioned well." The labor progressed slowly through the night. Garrett remained in the main room, keeping the fire stoked and water heated as instructed, occasionally approaching the bedroom door when Josephine's cries grew particularly intense. Near dawn, Mrs. Abernathy emerged briefly. "Won't be long now," she told Garrett, whose face was drawn with worry and exhaustion. "She's doing well." The sun was just cresting the eastern hills when a new sound filled the cabin, the lusty cry of a newborn. Garrett, who had been pacing for the last hour, stopped in his tracks, his expression a mixture of relief and wonder. After what seemed an eternity, Mrs. Abernathy appeared in the bedroom doorway, a small bundle in her arms. "Mr. Zachary, Mrs. Dawson would like you to meet someone." She placed the tightly wrapped infant in Garrett's startled arms. He looked down at the tiny red face with a shock of dark hair, his expression softening with awe. "A boy," Mrs. Abernathy said, a rare smile creasing her weathered face. "Healthy as a horse and strong lunge too, as you can hear." Garrett cradled the infant carefully, as if holding the most precious and fragile treasure in the world. "He's perfect," he whispered. "You can take him in to his mother now," Mrs. Abernathy instructed. "Just for a moment, she needs rest." Josephine lay against the pillows, her face pale and drawn with exhaustion but radiant with an inner light. When Garrett entered with the baby, she held out her arms eagerly. "Isn't he beautiful?" she asked as Garrett carefully transferred the bundle to her. "The most beautiful thing I've ever seen," Garrett agreed, his voice thick with emotion. Josephine looked up at him, her eyes shining with tears and joy. "I want to call him Thomas after my father, Thomas James Dawson." "It's a fine name," Garrett said softly, "a strong name." For a moment, they simply gazed at the miracle between them, Josephine with a mother's love, Garrett with a wonder that surprised him with its intensity. Something shifted in that quiet moment, something neither of them was prepared to name yet, but both felt in the depths of their hearts. Mrs. Abernathy broke the spell. "That's enough for now. Mother and child need rest." She shooed Garrett from the room, closing the door firmly behind him. Left alone in the main room, Garrett sank into his chair by the fire, overwhelmed by emotions he couldn't quite identify. There was relief, certainly, that Josephine and the baby were safe. But there was something else too, a powerful surge of protectiveness, of connection, of belonging. In the weeks that followed, a new rhythm established itself at Diamond Cross. Josephine recovered quickly from the birth, though Garrett insisted she continue to rest as much as possible. He hired Maria to come daily now, handling most of the household chores while Josephine focused on caring for Thomas. The baby thrived, gaining weight steadily and developing a surprisingly strong grip that delighted both adults. Garrett found himself increasingly enchanted by the infant, spending evenings holding the boy while Josephine prepared supper or simply rested. "You're good with him," Josephine observed one evening as Garrett walked the floor with a fussing Thomas, patting his back with gentle patience until the baby burped and settled contentedly against his shoulder. Garrett looked almost embarrassed. "Never had much to do with babies before. Guess it just comes natural with some." As February turned to March and the first signs of spring began to appear in the valley, Josephine became increasingly aware that her agreed trial period at Diamond Cross was nearing its end. The thought of leaving filled her with a sense of loss so profound it frightened her, One evening, after Thomas was asleep in his cradle, Josephine broached the subject that had been weighing on her mind. "Our 3-month arrangement ends next week," she said carefully, keeping her eyes on her mending. Garrett looked up sharply from the bridle he was repairing. "Has it been unsatisfactory?" "No, not at all," Josephine hastened to assure him. It's been wonderful, actually. I wasn't sure if you still wanted us here." Garrett set aside the bridle and leaned forward, his expression serious. "Josephine, I can't imagine Diamond Cross without you and Thomas now. I'd like you to stay indefinitely if you're willing." Relief washed over her, followed quickly by a niggling uncertainty. "As your housekeeper," Garrett hesitated, then stood and crossed to where she sat. Kneeling beside her chair, he took her hands in his. "If that's what you want, yes. But I've been hoping, really, that perhaps someday you might consider a different arrangement." His voice was steady, but she could feel a slight tremor in his hands. "I know it's too soon. You're still grieving Henry and you have Thomas to consider. But I want you to know that I've grown to care for you, for both of you, as more than just employees or even friends." Josephine's heart beat rapidly as she met his earnest gaze. "Garrett, you don't need to answer now," he said quickly. "Or even soon. Just know that when you're ready, if you're ever ready, I would be honored to court you properly." Tears welled in Josephine's eyes. "I'm not grieving Henry," she admitted softly. "I'm grieving the marriage I thought I had, the life I thought I was building. Henry and we were ill-suited from the start." She took a deep breath. "But I've found something here at Diamond Cross that I never expected to find again: peace, security, and—" she hesitated, "and feelings I thought I'd never experience." Hope dawned in Garrett's eyes. "Josephine, are you saying—" "I'm saying I care for you too," she whispered. "More than I should, perhaps, more than I was prepared for." Garrett's face broke into a smile of such joy that it transformed his weathered features. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he leaned forward and brushed his lips against hers in a kiss so tender it brought fresh tears to her eyes. "We'll take it slowly," he promised, drawing back slightly. "There's no rush." But Josephine found herself shaking her head. "We've been taking it slowly for months now. We've lived together, worked together, welcomed Thomas together." She smiled through her tears. "I know you, Garrett Zachary, better than I ever knew Henry in 3 years of marriage. I know you're kind and honorable and hardworking. I know you treat every living creature with respect. And I know that Thomas couldn't ask for a better man to look up to as he grows." Now it was Garrett who looked close to tears. "Does that mean—" "It means yes," Josephine said simply. "Yes to courting, yes to a future together, if that's truly what you want." "It's all I want," Garrett affirmed, squeezing her hands gently. "You and Thomas, you've become my family in ways I never imagined possible." From the bedroom, Thomas let out a small cry. Josephine moved to rise, but Garrett stopped her with a gentle hand. "Let me," he said, and there was such tenderness in those 2 simple words that Josephine's heart swelled with emotion. She watched as he crossed to the cradle and lifted Thomas with practiced ease, murmuring soothing words as he cradled the baby against his chest. The sight of them together, this strong man holding her son with such gentle care, filled her with a certainty that transcended all doubts. This was home. This was family. This was where she belonged. Spring unfolded across Diamond Cross in a riot of wildflowers and new growth. As April gave way to May, Garrett and Josephine's courtship progressed with the same steady, unhurried pace that characterized everything about their relationship. Each Sunday, weather permitting, they would pack a picnic and drive the wagon to a pretty spot by the creek, where Thomas could lie on a blanket in the dappled shade while they talked of plans for the ranch and shared dreams for the future. Sometimes Garrett would bring his harmonica, playing simple tunes that made Thomas kick his legs with delight and brought a soft smile to Josephine's face. Their first kiss had been followed by others, each one deeper, more confident than the last, but Garrett remained respectful, never pressing for more than Josephine was ready to give. Their living arrangement continued as before, with separate bedrooms and proper decorum maintained, though the glances they exchanged across the supper table grew increasingly charged with unspoken desire. By June, Thomas was sitting up on his own, reaching for objects with determined little hands and babbling constantly. His dark hair and eyes reminded Josephine of Henry, but his determined personality and quick smile seemed entirely his own. "He's got a strong will," Garrett observed one evening as they watched Thomas repeatedly attempting to grab a wooden spoon just beyond his reach. "Going to be a handful when he starts walking. Like someone else I know," Josephine teased, nudging Garrett's shoulder playfully. It was on a warm evening in late June that Garrett proposed properly. He had been unusually quiet all day, his manner distracted as he went about his chores. After supper, he asked Josephine to walk with him down to the creek, leaving Thomas in Maria's capable care. The setting sun painted the western sky in shades of gold and pink as they followed the well-worn path to their favorite spot. Fireflies were just beginning to emerge, their tiny lights blinking among the tall grasses. Garrett stopped beneath a large cottonwood tree and turned to face Josephine, taking both her hands in his. "I've been trying to think of fancy words," he began, his voice slightly rough with emotion, "but I'm not a man who's good with speeches, so I'll just say it plain." He dropped to one knee, still holding her hands. "Josephine Dawson, I love you. I love your strength and your kindness, your determination and your gentle heart. I love the way you sing to Thomas when you think no one's listening and the way you leave wildflowers in a jar on the table. I love the life we've started building here, and I want to build the rest of it together as husband and wife." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet pouch. From it, he extracted a simple gold band with a single small diamond. "It's not fancy," he said apologetically. "Had to order it special from Tucson." "It's perfect," Josephine whispered, tears blurring her vision. "Absolutely perfect." "Is that a yes?" Garrett asked, hope and uncertainty mingling in his expression. "Yes," Josephine said, her voice growing stronger. "Yes, Garrett Zachary, I will marry you." His face lit with joy as he slipped the ring onto her finger, then rose to pull her into an embrace that lifted her feet from the ground. Their kiss was deep and unhurried, filled with promise and passion, and the certainty of belonging. When they finally broke apart, breathless and laughing, the first stars were appearing in the deepening blue of the sky. "When?" Garrett asked simply. Josephine considered. "Soon. I don't want a long engagement or a fancy wedding. Just us, Thomas, and perhaps a few friends at the church in North Creek." "Next month," Garrett suggested, "would give me time to finish the addition to the cabin I've been planning." Josephine looked at him in surprise. "Addition?" Garrett nodded, suddenly shy. "Been working on plans for a proper bedroom for us, and eventually another for when Thomas gets bigger or if we—" He hesitated. "If we have more children someday." The thought of expanding their family, of having a child with Garrett, filled Josephine with a warm glow of anticipation. "I'd like that," she said softly. "Very much." Hand in hand, they walked back to the cabin, where Thomas greeted them with excited babbles, as if somehow sensing the joy his mother and soon-to-be father brought with them. They were married on the third Sunday in July, in the small white church in North Creek. The ceremony was simple but heartfelt, attended by a handful of neighboring ranchers, the Hargroves, who had traveled from Tucson for the occasion, Mrs. Abernathy and Maria's family. Josephine wore a new dress of pale blue silk. Garrett's gift with her dark hair arranged in a coronet of small white flowers. Thomas, resplendent in a miniature suit, was held by Mrs. Hargrove during the ceremony, occasionally adding his own commentary to the proceedings. The vows they exchanged were traditional, but spoken with such evident sincerity that more than one witness dabbed at their eyes. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Garrett's kiss was both tender and possessive, a promise of the night to come. The small reception was held at Diamond Cross, where tables had been set up in the yard beneath strings of lanterns. There was abundant food, music from local fiddlers, and dancing that continued well into the evening. Through it all, Garrett kept Josephine close, his hand rarely leaving the small of her back, his eyes frequently seeking hers with a look that made her blush. As the last guests departed, Josephine went to check on Thomas, who had long since been put to bed in his cradle, now moved to the small room that would be his alone. The baby slept soundly, one small fist curled beside his face. Josephine bent to kiss his forehead, her heart full of gratitude for this child who had, in a way, led her to this new life. When she entered their new bedroom, spacious and welcoming, with a large bed Garrett had crafted himself, she found her husband waiting, an uncharacteristic nervousness in his manner. "Mrs. Zachary," he said, testing the name as he reached for her. "Mr. Zachary," she replied, stepping willingly into his embrace. Their coming together was everything Josephine had hoped for, tender yet passionate, considerate yet deeply satisfying. In Garrett's arms, she found a completion she had never known, a union of bodies that matched the union of their hearts and lives. Afterward, lying in the circle of his arms with her head on his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart, Josephine reflected on the journey that had brought her here from desperate flight to profound happiness in less than a year. "What are you thinking?" Garrett murmured, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her bare shoulder. "I was thinking about the night we met," she answered truthfully. "How frightened I was, how alone I felt." Garrett's arms tightened around her. "I remember how brave you looked, standing there by that mesquite tree, ready to face the world alone." "I didn't feel brave," Josephine admitted. "I felt terrified." "That's what real courage is," Garrett said softly. "Being afraid but doing what needs doing anyway." Josephine propped herself up on one elbow to look into his face. "Do you know what I remember most about that night? Not the fear or the uncertainty, but the moment you handed me that purse and told me to breathe. Just breathe." She touched his face gently. "It was the first time in months anyone had shown me simple kindness." Garrett turned his head to kiss her palm. "I couldn't ride away and leave you there. Something wouldn't let me." "Providence," Josephine suggested. "Or just plain luck," Garrett countered with a smile. "Either way, I thank God every day that I took that road home." As they drifted toward sleep, wrapped in each other's arms, Josephine's last conscious thought was that sometimes the darkest nights truly did lead to the brightest dawns. Epilogue: 5 years later, the summer sun beat down on Diamond Cross Ranch, now nearly twice the size it had been when Josephine first arrived. The creek sparkled in the distance, and the expanded herd of cattle grazed contentedly in the valley pastures. The cabin had grown too, with additional rooms and a wide, wraparound porch where Thomas, now 5, was engaged in an animated sword fight with his 3-year-old brother Samuel, using sticks as their weapons. "En garde, Black Bart!" Thomas shouted, his dark hair flopping into his eyes as he lunged dramatically. "I'm not Black Bart. I'm a Texas Ranger," Samuel protested, his sandy hair and blue eyes so like his father's flashing with indignation. From inside the house came the sound of a baby's cry, quickly followed by Josephine's soothing voice. A moment later, she appeared in the doorway, their 6-month-old daughter, Elizabeth, on her hip. "You two settle down before someone loses an eye," she called to the boys, though her tone held more affection than sternness. "Your father will be back soon, and he's promised to take you fishing if you've been good." "We've been good, Mama." Both boys chorused, immediately abandoning their duel in favor of this new prospect. Josephine smiled, bouncing Elizabeth gently as the baby gummed her fist and drooled contentedly. At 29, Josephine had a few fine lines around her eyes and a roundness to her figure that spoke of contentment and motherhood. But she carried herself with the quiet confidence of a woman who knew her place in the world and was satisfied with it. The sound of hoofbeats announced Garrett's return from the north pasture. As always, Josephine felt her heart quicken at the sight of him tall and straight-backed in the saddle, his face weathered from years in the sun but his smile as warm as ever when he caught sight of his family waiting on the porch. "There's my army," he called as he dismounted, lifting his hat in greeting. The boys raced down the steps, tackling his legs with delighted squeals. Garrett scooped up Samuel with one arm and ruffled Thomas's hair with his free hand. "Were you good for your mother?" he asked, his tone mock serious. "Yes, sir," Thomas assured him earnestly. "We practiced our letters and helped with the chickens and everything. Then I believe I promised some fishing," Garrett said, setting Samuel down and reaching for the fishing poles leaning against the porch railing. As the boys darted off to dig for worms, Garrett climbed the steps to greet his wife and daughter properly. Elizabeth gurgled happily at the sight of her father, reaching pudgy arms toward him. "Hello, my sweet girl," he murmured, taking the baby from Josephine and pressing a kiss to her downy head. "And what about her mother?" Josephine asked, arching an eyebrow playfully. Garrett's free arm encircled her waist, drawing her close for a kiss that, even after nearly 5 years of marriage, still made her toes curl. "Hello, Mrs. Zachary." "Hello, Mr. Zachary," she replied, her voice soft with affection. "Productive day." "Very." "That new bull is settling in well with the herd." He glanced toward the boys, now excitedly comparing worms. "I shouldn't be too long at the creek. Need to be back in time to clean up for supper." "The Johnsons are still coming, right?" Josephine nodded. "Emma's bringing her apple pie." "Best in the county," Garrett agreed, reluctantly handing Elizabeth back to her mother. "Boys, let's go before those fish decide to swim upstream." As Garrett led the chattering boys down the path toward the creek, fishing poles over their shoulders, Josephine sat in the rocking chair Garrett had made when she was expecting Samuel. Elizabeth nestled against her breast, nursing contentedly while Josephine hummed a lullaby. From this vantage point, she could see most of Diamond cross the expanded barn, the thriving orchard they had planted 3 years ago, the small schoolhouse being built near the road where children from neighboring ranches would soon join Thomas for lessons with the teacher they had hired collectively. It was a good life, not always easy, with its share of droughts and harsh winters, illnesses and anxieties, but rich in the ways that mattered most. There was love in abundance, honest work that brought satisfaction, and the profound security of knowing that she was exactly where she belonged. As the afternoon sun bathed the valley in golden light, Josephine's thoughts drifted back, as they occasionally did, to that desperate night when she had fled Silver Creek with nothing but a carpetbag and the child growing inside her. How close she had come to a very different life, one of grinding poverty, perhaps, or dependence on strangers' charity. Instead, fate or providence had placed Garrett Zachary on that desert trail, a man whose simple act of kindness had changed the course of not only her life, but Thomas's as well, and led to the creation of the family that now flourished at Diamond Cross. Elizabeth sighed in milky contentment, her eyelids drooping as she drifted toward sleep. In the distance, Josephine could hear the faint sounds of her husband and sons at the creek, Garrett's deep laugh, Thomas's excited exclamation, Samuel's high-pitched questions. These were the sounds of happiness, Josephine thought as she gently rocked her daughter. These were the sounds of home, and to think it had all begun with a purse pressed into trembling hands and 4 simple words that had given her the courage to go on. "Take this and breathe."